Hello, and welcome to the Mik One podcast, where I sit down with industry leaders to discuss the project-to-product movement. I'm Mik Kirsten, founder and CEO of Tasktop and best-selling author of Project to Product, how to survive and thrive in the age of digital disruption with the Flow framework. My next guest needs no introduction, as it is none other than Gene Kim. Gene has done more to elevate how enterprise software is built than anyone I know. He has a magical ability to connect the plight of the individual developer with the technology and business landscape of the entire organization. The mental models and success patterns that Gene outlined in the Phoenix Project and Unicorn Project have done more to point leaders in the right direction than any other works that I know of. So what's so exciting about this podcast is that Gene actually reveals the next book that he's working on, which in my opinion is going to have an even more profound impact on how leaders at all levels think about the intersection of people, technology, and business. So without further ado, let's learn where Gene's journey will take the industry next. Welcome, everyone. I could not be more delighted to have Gene Kim with us here today. So Gene, I think more than anyone I know, anyone that I think anyone I know knows, has influenced the way that organizations think about software delivery, about software at scale, about how we create what Gene has been calling these dynamic learning organizations. And I think the really exciting thing about this particular podcast is I get to actually ask Gene about what he's working on now, which I've heard is another book. So I think the amazing thing, Gene, is that each of these books for you is this incredible journey. I've had a chance to be in I don't know if it's the backseat or as a passenger or running behind your car on these journeys sometimes, and it's just a thrilling experience. And you're in the midst of another one of these now. But before we dive in, I've just been amazed at the effect that the Unicorn Project has had on how the people I interact with think and how it's really changed the perspective. It's given senior leadership a perspective on what it's like to actually be there on the ground floor, the struggles that Maxine had, and just the sheer fact that this book actually made it to the number 2 position on the Wall Street Journal nonfiction list is a testament to the sort of impact it made and is continuing to make. So just tell us a bit about what this was like from your perspective, about the journey of the Unicorn Project, and then we'll dive into what you're doing next.
Oh, for sure. By the way, it's great to be back on the podcast, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate all our collaborations over the years, and how much I've learned from you, and how much of that actually made it into the Unicorn Project. For sure, yeah. I guess I am thrilled with the way that I think the Unicorn Project has shown people what software development is often like in large, complex organizations. And that I think we know, maybe, if we're lucky, they might have seen Silicon Valley, right? And I think we have some preconceived notions of how productive developers can be or are in actuality. And it's just so sad that in so many organizations, they're in a tundra of technical debt. And what I love about the Unicorn Project is that Maxine, who is the best developer at Parts Unlimited, who that was introduced in the Unicorn in the Phoenix Project, right? When she gets exiled to the Phoenix Project, she can't do anything by herself. Can't build, can't test, can't build a feature, can't deploy, and I think that really describes the problems that most large complex organizations have in terms of delivering technical capabilities. And I think that's really kind of at the center of the DevOps enterprise community in terms of the stories that they share. And the leaders in the DevOps enterprise community, I mean, that is what they're solving for, right? They are unleashing the full human creativity and capabilities of all these of the 18 million developers on the planet. I think if that book has even shown a glimpse of what that reality is and what it could really truly should be, then I couldn't be happier with that.
Yeah, and I think that hits on why I think this book is so important, and why the way that I related to people who just don't have a sense, they've never lived those kinds of dynamics, right? Which is that there's this aspirational reality that boards, that CEOs, that leaders want to have in terms of turning their organizations into software innovators. And then there's the reality that their teams are actually dealing with, right? Where you end up with these beautiful roadmaps, plans to make the best systems of engagement applications, mobile applications, and web experiences, and that just doesn't translate to the dynamics that are in the organization. And I think the amazing thing about the Unicorn Project is it makes, in a language that leaders understand, it translates for them what these realities are like, and it has them empathize with the teams, with the fact that you can't simply have these wonderful strategic plans and roadmaps when you don't have the right kind of when you're in this, as you said, Gene, this tundra of technical debt. Yeah. So right. How have you seen it get interpreted? Because I've absolutely, I think, seen the way that the book has helped bridge some of that gap between the dynamics that an individual contributor on a team or a team member who's trying to do great for the organization, do great for their customer, is struggling with day to day, and the aspirations of the organization to, again, become more innovative and survive and thrive.
Yeah. Oh boy. I mean, that's such a big question. I can give some stories that have delighted me in terms of how people have responded to it. I mean, I think one is the as you said, the sense of empathy, where you have non-technology leaders reading it and getting a glimpse of the reality, both in the not ideal, and getting a vision of like what ideal really could be, and specifically. Some interaction that really made me laugh, right, is the scene where there's a board consultant that comes in and, they've actually allocated more money for contractors to come in and help shore up, the Phoenix project. And it turns out that all the contractors, are in the same position that Maxine's in. they're going out to lunch and, they're still waiting for, license keys and credentials, and, they still haven't been onboarded. And so, it does beg this very uncomfortable question, like, oh my gosh, like, where's all that money going? Right. And all those promises that were made in terms of like, we need those additional people, right, to achieve these goals. Well, if they're, if they're not actually working productively, does that mean that we're in trouble? And the answer is yes. Another story I heard was this about, in an outage, the post-mortem meeting of just how fragile psychological safety is, and how leaders can do things that help, right? That make sure. I love this phrase. Improvement requires honesty, but honesty requires absence of fear, right? And so there are things that leaders can do to increase fear, right, which suppresses important signals, or there are things that leaders can do to create true environments that actually foster people to say what they really think, and those are amplify important signals. So, I love that we're starting to really connect the dots between what is needed, within technology organizations to co-create value with business leadership.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is one of the fascinating things about the Unicorn Project, which is it shows this stark contrast between what great looks like, what these ideals are, and this very explicit contrast, and then of course what a lot of our listeners are dealing with every single day. And
by the way, I'm laughing not because it's funny. I'm laughing quite the opposite, right? It's terrible. Yeah. But someday, right, it will be more just, right? And people won't have to suffer like this, and they'll be able to appreciate the flow, right? The second ideal flow, that feeling that we have when we're able to be as productive as if we were working by ourselves, but it's better because now we can work with friends and colleagues, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. And I think and you're right. It's not funny in the cases where people are dealing with these things, but at least it gives them, their teams, their organizations, a goal and aspiration to focus on, and makes it very crisp and clear. And it's been, ever since the book was published, it is interesting to me how I come back to different ideals over the course of time. And I think some of these map very directly into the way that you're starting to think about these signals being suppressed or signals being amplified in organizations, and how that maps to high-performing organizations and some of the dysfunctions that we see. But you touched on psychological safety. When you first put out the Unicorn Project, I didn't realize how big a problem the suppression of signals from technology teams was in large organizations, and how that really impeded the flow of work. So if you could just tell us a little bit more how you think about these signals, because again, there's something that you've been constructed here where when the right signals go up in the organization, go horizontal in the organization, we actually get to that point of flow, or at least there's a chance to resolve these bottlenecks. And Maxine actually manages to pull this off within her organization. So tell us a little bit more how you think about these signals, because I think to a lot of us, this is a really new concept.
Yeah, and so this is what I've been working on with Dr. Steven Spear, who has been a mentor of mine for nearly a decade. And there are a couple of things. I mean, so he is most famous for writing the most downloaded Harvard Business Review article of all time. It's called "Decoding the DNA of the Toyota Production System." And so that was actually based on his doctoral dissertation at the Harvard Business School. And that was, he actually worked on the plant floor of a tier 1 Toyota supplier for 6 months, which I thought was just, incredible. And, so he's taken those learnings and applied them not just to the high repetition manufacturing work, but to engine design at Pratt & Whitney, which is very a creative endeavor, to healthcare systems, to helping build a safety culture at Alcoa. So there were a couple of things that he's said. Actually, there are many things that he said, but one of the things that always caught my attention is when he used the word structure and dynamics. And The reason I think this is important is that for me, it really started to form in my mind a very parsimonious way of explaining why organizations work the way they do, both in the ideal and not ideal. And so it's really saying that any organization has a structure, and so that's the way that we organize teams and the roles and responsibilities and the interfaces between the teams. So I guess I love it. Most leaders know about the 2 R's, roles and responsibilities, but there's a third R, the relationships, right? So as architects, we would call them the interfaces, right? What are the sanctioned interfaces? What components can talk to each other, and how do they talk to each other? So that's structure. And then dynamics is everything else. And so we can imagine a set of dynamics, as you mentioned, right, where weak signals of potential failures are amplified, right? Because we have tone at the top that says safety is the number one thing. When someone pulls an andon cord in the Toyota production system, the first thing that someone says is thank you, right? And those amplify weak signals. Or we can imagine a scenario where these failure signals are suppressed or extinguished entirely. So, if everyone's afraid to tell bad news, if that causes people to not say what they really think or say what they really see, right? And suddenly, you end up with dynamics that lead to not great outcomes, or maybe even disastrous outcomes. And maybe just to add one more thing, a very kind of recent aha moment for me is that I think that you can actually predict whether an organization is high performing or low performing just at looking at the communication paths. In other words, like in the, do you have a communication where communications are dominated by up and down communication, up and down the org chart? So in the Unicorn project, right, in order to get 2 engineers to talk to each other, you had to escalate up 2 levels and then down 2, or maybe up 8 levels and down 8, right, just to do what the customer asks. But imagine another scenario, which I think is associated with the high performers, where the majority of the communications are happening within the teams or between teams, and they're happening at the edges. And escalation, when they occur, they escalate 1, right, not 8. And so, I think that's what the Toyota andon cord is that, if someone has a problem, they pull the andon cord, and in most cases, they can be resolved by the team lead, right? If they can't resolve it in 55 seconds, it may escalate to a group area lead, right? But these are showing that people can solve problems locally without, vast escalations and without vast disturbances in other areas of the system. And so really I think for me, the aha moment is these up and down communications tend to be very lossy. They tend to be slow, right? To get 2 managers to talk to each other takes a week. To get 2 VPs to talk to each other takes a month, right? And so, the information flowing up is very incomplete, slow. So that means integrated problem solving across 2 functional specialties are going to be, not ideal. Whereas if you can get them embedded into the same teams, right, that's a very fast problem solving dynamic. And so I think in control theory, the 4 axes of these type of communications, it's speed, frequency, fidelity, and accuracy, right? And so you want fidelity and accuracy in the planning processes. So when leaders plan, we want them to be very specific. We want them to write things down. We want them to be very thoughtful in terms of how they organize. But that is not the dynamic we want in operations. Like when people are solving problems, right? You want those, to be, especially in, let's say, military operations and production operations, you want fast, frequent communications. Does that resonate with you, Mik?
Yeah, I mean, it completely does. And I think the reason it resonates with me, because I think it's you're laying out a new set of tools that I think leaders and organizations and everyone trying to get towards the high performance can use. Because so often I've seen these amazing efforts to get to these points of flow and feedback and joy go sideways. And then at an organizational structure level and an operating model level, leadership just starts blaming the culture, right? It's the culture is the problem, and then actually teams start blaming the culture. The leadership culture is the problem, and I just so often find that line of thinking is just a dead end, because and everyone's now putting up slides how culture eats strategy for breakfast and these great kinds of Drucker quotes and such. But when we dig in, I know my experiences are when you actually start digging in. Okay, well, what's the problem with the culture? And then you start asking and talking to people, or looking at actually some of the system data, and what you see is the way things are structured. You've got a team who's incredibly frustrated because they've been waiting for input for 3 weeks. That meeting between those 2 VPs that's had them completely blocked and unable to deliver on the needs of the business, the customer, and then of course getting blamed and all of this. So I think the really interesting thing here is that this is actually it feels to me like you're creating, along with Steven Spear, a new way for leaders to think about organizational structure that can maximize flow or that can impede flow. And I feel like we just haven't had those tools. We know value stream flow is good. We know when you don't have these wait states, you don't have these bottlenecks, you don't have these long queues, things are better. But how do we get them from an organization point of view to that point? And again, I think that's exactly what we're lacking. So would you say that you are creating those tools for us and you're going to put all of this in your new book?
Yeah, and so the book, we're targeting end of 2021, maybe 2022, maybe early 2023. So it's like at the point where, you're really in the early stages. And so I'm really on a learning journey, just trying to clarify my own thinking. And I can't tell you how much of that is informed by, the regular discussions that we have, twice a month. If I can just add one more thing. So, if you think about sort of the cognitive kind of characteristics of work, right? You have, upfront, you have the planning, you have rehearsing, and then you have operations, right? Or performing. So you want the performing, you want the operations kind of in that fast mode. You want the sort of the planning, in that slow mode, but you return to slow mode again, during retrospectives, right? It's like when you ask the question, are we achieving our goal? Right? This is when General Stanley McChrystal asks in Team of Teams, we're winning tactically, but are we winning strategically, right? And then the answer was no. No, it's like something drastically different is needed, right? So again, that's the type of thinking we need for that assessment improvement area. So if I could wave a magic wand, I'm hoping that what this does is provide some more practical tools to be able to describe kind of what makes for good culture, what makes for bad culture, right? And there's something that I find very satisfying about this very parsimonious, almost mechanistic way of kind of describing how organizations work. I mean, when I say mechanistic, I mean, it's almost like I've even heard Steven Spear say, you configure the system and then you let it run, right? So configuration is a structure, yep. Dynamics is the run, right? It seems like an absurd reductionist way to view the world, but I'm finding it, to be incredibly useful to describe, scenarios where we've seen like that's high performing and scenarios that we know is not high performing, like Team of Teams, right? Before, right, in the kind of the bad old ways, they were larger, they had better technology, they had better intelligence, and yet they could not dismantle the terrorist networks in Iraq in 2004. And the reason is that you had the intelligence analysts, Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, all working in different functional silos, and for them to actually work together involved vast escalations. So when they were able to embed into mission-oriented teams where they could work in a simpler structure with a shared goal, right? The majority of communication is happening at the edges, and a 22-year-old intelligence analyst or a drone pilot can actually see something and actually do something about it, and resulted in sighting to capture in 45 minutes. So I think we can say the same thing about DevOps, right? In the bad old days of the Phoenix Project, right? And Fat Parts Unlimited, DevOps was exactly the same dynamic in the bad old ways. And when they embed into mission-oriented teams, it allows for not only better outcomes, but innovation at the edges. So they say the goal of science is to explain the most amount of observable phenomena with the fewest number of principles, confirm deeply held intuitions, and reveal surprising insights. For me, these kind of tools are absolutely doing that for me.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we need, right? Is we need a simple reductionist set of tools where, again, we're not solving this massive culture problem and thinking that everyone needs to attend a whole new set of seminars every 3 days, but actually understand how we're preventing people from doing the great work and having those communication lines, which they tend to know are effective, right? They will actually, even if they have to go through the square problem, they'll find their ways. The organization will make those lines. So
can I give you like one thing that I just heard recently that excited me? So, we were talking about like in control theory, right? The notion of frequency, speed, fidelity, and accuracy. So, when you can get two people from two different functional silos doing integrated problem solving, and you have them working side by side instead of through tickets or through reports, not only is the information loss much lower, you can actually generate information, you can actually generate knowledge, right? And so I heard the story about a chief chemist named Beth in a large pharmaceutical firm. She said, hey, instead of having the biologist send reports, how about you present the data to our entire team? And so that resulted in a whole bunch of new knowledge being created that allowed them to actually better target and prioritize pharmaceuticals with more accuracy and deliver them to market with less speed. So I think these are and you can see that's probably the same dynamic occurs in product teams when you can get the product owner directly in the team with the engineers. Amazing breakthroughs are made, just like, and you see the same pattern with team of teams. So I think kind of these, for me, it was just a kind of an aha moment to be able to really say, here's how they're similar, regardless of the domain.
Yeah, I think one of the conversations we had recently is what a lot of organizations experienced in the past year is removing some of the structure constraints and seeing how quickly things can move. Earlier today, I heard an amazing story of what happens in disaster response, right? Where all of a sudden procurement processes change completely. People at the leaves of the organization can actually put purchases on their credit card just to get generators, just to get electricity, just to get emergency supplies where they need to be. And so I think this was, again, the fact that you've now incepted this notion of structure and dynamics into my mind, I think into a lot of other people's. I think it shows us the power of that, right? If we just change this part of structure to allow this faster flow, in this case, to the edges, how much more quickly can we actually get the kinds of results? And I think it's been absolutely amazing for me to see the number of large enterprise organizations who released some of those structural constraints due to the pandemic and all of a sudden saw a kind of faster flow that they thought was impossible within their large and complex organization.
Yeah, in fact, one of my favorite presentations from DevOps Enterprise last year was from the Nationwide Building Society. It was the Chief Operations Officer, Patrick Altridge, and the mission leader, Janet. And they're talking about how there were things that they had to do, in this dire emergency that normally would have taken, quarters that they could do in weeks, like provisioning out VPN access for every company employee. I think what global pandemic has showed us is when, during these situations of extreme urgency, when we're willing to, throw away the rule book, miracles are possible, right? And so I think that brings up the incredible question. It's like, how come we can't do that all the time?
Yeah, exactly. Well, and this gives us a language to think about, okay, what structure did we change? What communication lines did we enable, right? In order to actually get to that kind of pace. So I think, again, you're giving us a new tool for how to think about that. And I think that just relating back to, I just have these very vivid memories of this call that we were on together with Dr. Steven Spear, where we were talking to one of our colleagues in an organization that had a very problematic structure that suppressed some signals that shouldn't have been suppressed, and those signals caused outages that shouldn't have happened, or that suppression caused outages that shouldn't have happened, things that should have been resolved. And of course, the question is always, okay, well, how do we get from where we are today to where we need to be? How do we prove this out? And you said something I'd not heard before, Gene. It's the configure and then run. And it just made me think of what Dr. Steven Spear said in this particular conversation is, well, how do you do this? Just make a model line. Just create a place in your organization where the structure is what you think, what the structure needs to be. And it is around flow and value rather than around all these things that have built up, and then see how that works. So what's your sense of that? Because this whole configure and run thing, I think I see so many organizations trying to go through the next massive reorg, right? To implement a Spotify model across 30,000 global IT staff and hope that structure works. But there's nothing empirical to that, right? They haven't learned. There's no feedback cycle. There's no learning from actually, did this structure work for us, right? This is something I think one of the big problems of some of the really big agile transformations is it's this big cookie cutter being applied without any learning for how did this new structure that we implemented work? Did it enable the right kinds of flows, or do we have some regulatory constraints that maybe the last organization that this didn't? So, can you dig a bit more into this configure and run idea?
Yeah, and I'm a long way from, I think, understanding and knowing kind of how to do the transformation. But I mean, here's some things that I have learned that I'm finding very dazzling in terms of bringing clarity. So when you have these, you have the structures that are dominated by up-down communications, which are slow, lossy, and so forth. And then you have the more dynamic and energetic configurations where the communications are dominated across the edge, across the vast functional specialties. And so I think there are two characteristics that are created that are kind of a prerequisite, and we're calling it simplification and stabilization. So simplification means that you are creating a value stream, that they tend to be simpler, meaning more linear, right? So I know who my inputs are and I know who my outputs are. And so that means between the chief chemist and the chief biologist, right? And the chemist and the biologist in their relative organizations, right? They have an input and an output. And they tend to be more explicit then less explicit. No, I guess you could call it more explicit, less tacit. So people know who their upstream and downstream customers are. And so that's how you end up with, the value streams. So everything doesn't. I think the most obvious one is an assembly line, where like everyone just stays in one spot on the assembly line, and the assembly line moves work from one station to another, right? But you have things like work centers where work is passed to another. You have team of teams where it's the Rangers, intelligence analysts, and the Navy SEALs. You have ones where it's like requirements, design, develop, deploy, operate, etc. Right? I mean, those are all flows are more explicit, more linear, and then I think the really other exciting characteristic is that of stabilization. If you can just, so one of the stories that blew me away when Steve told this to me, he said back in the 1990s he went to visit a Toyota plant in Japan with his mentor and advisor, Dr. Kent Bowen, at the Harvard Business School, and a VP of manufacturing from a big three auto plant. And they saw many amazing things. And one of them was the fact that they were doing 60 line side store changes per day. so I didn't know what that was. So it's basically at every work center, it's basically the racks where you put the inputs, the raw materials of which they process, and then put in the output rack, right? And so the VP of manufacturing from the American big three auto manufacturer said, that's crap, right? Basically, in disbelief, or basically saying they're lying, right? Because he said, we did 6 in one day, and we ended up shutting the plant down for 3 days because suddenly parts weren't where they're supposed to be, and we couldn't do final assembly, and we couldn't ship a car for 3 days. So, I think in our community, the equivalent story is the 2009 Allspa Hammond presentation that said we're doing 10 deploys a day every day at Flickr, right? And I think most people vomited when they heard that story because, I think our reaction was, we do 10 a year, and that's not so good. What maniac would do 10 a day, right? And I think what's in common is that at the Toyota plant and at Flickr, it showed that you could do small changes, things were loosely coupled enough where local changes could be made without bringing the entire place down, that it didn't cause global catastrophe, chaos, and disruption. Whereas in the big three auto plant and in most, many IT organizations, everything's so tightly coupled together that you can't change anything, right? You change one little thing, and just like in the American manufacturing plant, the MRP, you miss one setting in the MRP, and suddenly parts aren't where they're supposed to be, and you can't ship cars. So I think that stabilization, right, the ability to make local changes, make adjustments, that is obviously one of the properties of kind of this and prerequisites of kind of high performance, of dynamic learning organizations. One more thing. And so I think what's exciting about the team story is that you now see these different structures and mechanisms to broadcast learnings. It reminds me of the daily call they had. It was 90 minutes a day, 365 days a year. It was basically the top leaders, reaffirming the goals, reviewing kind of the actions from the previous day, and then people asking for help, right? And there was a way for, 3,500 people on this call to trade, say what's working, what help is needed, groups to form problems. And it even became a mechanism they found that the constraint to doing raids was often helicopter transport or ability to access, surveillance drones. And so what ended up happening is everyone knows the goals. People would actually horse trade for spots and be able to say, hey, I think this mission is urgent. I agree. How about we swap spaces? And so I think this emergence of an internal market that allowed for kind of replanning at the local levels versus at the macro level, I think it has to be another property of what's possible. Does that resonate with you, Mik?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And I think I just want to go back a little bit because I think the thing that you've challenged the DevOps Enterprise Summit audience with for the last several years is how do we actually elevate what we've known to work for technology, what we've known in terms of enabling fast flow, enabling this kind of delivery of value to organizations, right? And you call these things that dynamic learning organizations. I think what you're saying right now is that some of these changes become very easy, right? It's like how many times you deploy it per day, how quickly learning is incorporated into a flow and feedback loop, right? And it's going straight back to the Phoenix project, of course. So the fascinating thing about this is that you're actually now looking at this lens at this through the lens not just of high-performing tech companies, but actually organizations delivering all sorts of value, right? So how much, I guess, can you just tell us a little, and like, I think so much of the literature that a lot of us have been exposed to really does come from manufacturing. And how do we learn from these manufacturing concepts and apply them to technology organizations? But you've now gone in this latest exploration journey, Gene, you've gone well beyond that to studying other kinds of teams and structures in the end of knowledge work, of which software is a type. So it sounds like you're starting to see these common patterns of loose coupling, of basically work and information being able to be processed quickly at the edges, of changes becoming easy. There's this notion of stabilization and simplicity as well. So I guess what do you see happening? Are we learning from technology, or are technologists now going to learn from actually effective organizational structures?
So I, like you, am a avid follower of and a convert of Dr. Carlota Perez, and I think I find her narrative of in any given technology revolution, it will create a new management model that can properly exploit the new technology that's been created. And I love that notion that scientific management, mass manufacturing has led to a set of beliefs and a cohesive set of practices, like the Gantt chart, like project management, like rigid, strict command and control structures, like outsourcing development and technology. And there is probably another set of beliefs and practices and tools and techniques that lead to things like Agile and DevOps and the Toyota production system and resilience engineering and and I think our aspiration, right, is really to describe what that is, right? So just as Taylorism has led to the set of practices, I'd love to be able to describe what are those principles that lead to these things that we all maybe are aware of, but be able to say that's actually all part of the same cloth. So that's kind of my hope, and I think I'd love to be able to stitch together is to say that yes, it is the technology community that is pioneering it, but it is actually the same thing as what led to the effective harnessing of the atom, of what led us to be able to send a man safely to the moon and back, right? The Toyota production system, team of teams, those are all actually the same patterns at work. By the way, I got to share with you a book that I had so much fun reading. So I got to interview Dr. Ron Westrom, famous for his Westrom organizational typology model. Dr. Nicole Forrest is going to introduce me to him in an email. And so I actually was able to interview him for my podcast. And in preparation for that, I realized that he had actually written a book on the Sidewinder missile program in the 1960s. So, and it was just utterly fascinating. And basically he contrasts the wild success of the Sidewinder missile program to the failed Falcon missile program, which eventually became the Phoenix missile, and the Sparrow program. And it was just amazing. Like what he said, you had integrated problem solving in the Sidewinder group. People, the mechanics could talk to the engineers, could talk to the technicians, very fast feedback. You say, let's try something, and you would, the machinist would actually make it, and you could try it that evening. Whereas the Falcon program had, I think it's like 10 to 100 times the number of engineers working on it. At one point, 3,000 to 5,000 engineers working on it. But they had prematurely specified what the architecture looked like. And so even though you had more engineers, in fact, some people say smarter engineers, but they were constrained and couldn't actually unleash creativity, whereas the much smaller Sidewinder group really broke ground on so many different fronts. And it was the most successful missile program in history.
Yeah, I think, again, we're missing these tools, right? We're missing, I think, organizations leaders are missing a tool for understanding why, let's say, a SpaceX can deliver so much more with under 100 people working on it than massive programs can. And I think if you can, and just like the examples that you gave, right? I think, again, if you can give us the language for understanding how to describe what are effective flows, what are ineffective, why adding that next set of 100 or 200 people might actually have the reverse effect, because all of a sudden the communication patterns are not what we need them to be, right? Or, and this is why I think we've seen, I think you and I have been studying these very effective patterns, right? Where there's independence and autonomy for value streams, things tend to flow faster. When there's large amounts of dependencies, you get into these communication patterns that are unsustainable and often self-destructive.
Well, I have one more story, by the way, that we had talked about before that I just think really motivates your notion of a model line. So I got to spend 3 hours with the chief operating officer of one of the 4 healthcare systems here in Oregon. Yes. And we visited the vaccination clinics that's happening at the Portland Convention Center, where they are vaccinating 8,500 people per day. But that was up from 250 to 500 to 2,000. And so and just to see the sheer amount of creativity and ingenuity that was being unleashed, in the service of the most important societal mission we have on the, which is to vaccinate everybody on the planet as quickly as possible. And it was just amazing to hear this person reflect on the lessons that he's learning and wants to take back to other aspects of healthcare. And, he's saying that the chief medical officer who was with me, he said, I'm in an emergency department, and to change the brand of tissue we use requires weeks of committee meetings, and the answer is always no, right? How can we integrate these incredible learnings and integrate them into potentially all aspects of healthcare delivery? So I just think it's just shows that the power of that model line, and yet another example of this terrible thing that's happened over the last year. How it's just uncovering a different way of working that I am sure is going to dramatically change how we're going to be working in the future, for the better.
Yeah, but I think again, only if organizations realize that they see that this is possible. They see that by changing the structure, all of a sudden a speed that was unfathomable before is possible. And I think sadly we have many counterexamples where that didn't happen, right? Where we've got the same structure remain to try to do something as bold as the rate of vaccinations that countries have had to deploy, and then the place will now be able to, I think, apply your approach of structural dynamics to understand why in some places these things happen very effectively, like the example of Oregon that you just described, whereas in other places it didn't. There was all the budget, there was all the desire, but the structure never allowed these dynamics of fast immunizations to happen. So yeah, Gene, to me, it's mind-blowing. I have to say that, again, some of these concepts that I've been hyper-focused on how they work with technology and communication and collaboration in delivering value to software, you're actually now identifying in a much broader set of I think what you're calling it is right. It's these dynamic learning organizations that are going to define how high performance, how we strive for high performance in the age of software.
In fact, sorry, I would get so excited when I talk with you, and so I think kind of in the. I would imagine in this book, in the first 2 paragraphs, right? You've been thrown into this competition. You've won the tournament that got to where you were. Yet you find that your competitors are beating you. Designing things for the customers in less time with less effort, right? And despite the same starting line, the same talent pool, the same the same physics, right? But the line that I just would love to land is that it's as if your organization is actually fighting you. And I think that is actually true, right? If you're not appropriately thoughtful about the way you structure the organization, the roles, responsibilities, and the relationships, well, then you will get the wrong outcome, right? And I think that there's something really delightful to me, right? That we might have a better tool to think with in terms of, how do we, solve problems that are more than one person, right? When you have a team of teams, right? How do you actually configure them in a way so that you can actually get that you're 10 times better, right? Not 10 times slower.
Yeah, no, and I think this is, it's reminding me of early on in my career when I realized that high performing developers were, they seem to be 100 or 1,000 in some cases times more productive than the average developer, right? And the thousands rare, but the Linus Torvalds of the world, in terms of how much value that we're able to create through their software. So, and how much value that's today it's something like the Linux kernel is providing the economy. So, right. I think the thing that I'm absolutely observing play itself out right now is that I think we've understood this somewhat at the team level of high performing teams, lower performing teams. But I think this is just less well understood. And the empirical data that I'm seeing is that we see organizations with a flow efficiency. So just the efficiency of how they're delivering value, that's 1 or 2 or 3%. And then we see organizations with, and this is, I think, to your point, with the same budgets, the same numbers of staff, just organized differently with a different structure and a different set of dynamics that's evolved around value delivery, and it's evolved much more incrementally, who have flow efficiencies of 60, 70, 80%. And that actually translates when you scale that to a significant number of staff. You're getting into these 1 or 2, maybe 3 order of magnitude differences. So I think again, this is the key thing that we need to help leaders understand how to approach architecting for flow, for value, that's missing today. And again, just where culture is being blamed. We're not giving a culture a chance. That when your organization is fighting against you and you feel that every single day, culture does not have a chance. So I think, illustrating that in the opening chapters would be very effective. So,
in fact, I mean, we've had so many conversations about how, the best in these tech giants, the best developers are put on dev productivity. Right, the most experienced and the next best, most experienced ones are put on backend systems, and the most junior developers are put on features, and which is like the opposite of what we often see in many IT organizations, where they put the best developers on features, and the next best ones on backend systems, and the most junior ones and the summer interns build systems and dev productivity platforms, and. I think what I find exciting about that is that I think that's a hint that there is a big advantage in being big, right? You can hire the best talent, and you can get leverage on the platforms that you build. So I talk so often about the trip that we made together to visit Chris O'Malley at CompuWare, right? And as he told us about the Robert Murdoch quote, "Big does not beat small anymore. Instead, it is fast beating the slow." And then the Chris O'Malley corollary, right, is that the only thing better than being fast is being big and fast, right? And I think, when you can when you create the right structure and dynamics, then, size can actually be an advantage, right? Yeah. You get to, learn from the best developers and engineers on the planet, right? And that has multiplicative effects as well, so.
Yeah, and then again, I think I'm sure this is going to happen to other people listening, because it happened to me as soon as Gene started talking about this. This has been years. These journeys of yours are quite long, so it's probably been over a year since you get this bug of structure and dynamics in my mind. But I think, as you said that, I realized, why is it so important that those best developers are on dev productivity? We know that with software, the structure of the software actually changes the dynamics, right? And the software is the broader sense, and this includes the operational software. So if all of a sudden I can get myself, 10 TensorFlow environments to pump data into without talking to anyone, any VPs, well, guess what? That structure allows me to accelerate with my machine learning experiments or efforts much more readily. So, and that all of that, of course, comes from the developer productivity people who are able to make it very easy for any developer to get these environments, to connect to a pipeline, to automate all of these sorts of things. So I think there's, again, using that language and that tool, because software and infrastructure is just such a key part of the structure of a technology organization, investing in the people who can adjust and evolve that structure in support of better dynamics is a really good investment. So,
I've got to tell this story, and I haven't told you this before. So I got a chance to talk to Admiral John Richardson. So he was chief of naval operations for 4 years. Yeah, so that's the highest ranking uniformed officer in the U.S. Navy, responsible for 300,000 sailors. And he was describing the leadership dynamic within the U.S. Navy. So apparently the U.S. Navy, the navies are famous for decentralization, right? Because not so long ago, once they went over the horizon, you couldn't talk to them anymore, right? So you had to write very good orders, right? And then captains had a lot of autonomy. He talked a little bit about that in terms of, like, as a leader, you invest a lot in terms of building relationships, creating a common set of values, specifying what the mission goals are, right? You call it commander's intent. Here's the things we're trying to achieve. It's good if you do this, turn over the card, right? Here are things we'd appreciate if you don't do this, because that's not helpful, right? If you lose communications, right? Here's some procedures, and then you let them go, right? And he said this line, because by the time communication comes back to headquarters, the fidelity of the communication is so low, and the speed of the communication is so slow that there's very little useful feedback that you can give back, right? And so, as you talk about that VP getting, for approval, I mean, for me, that was a very startling thing to hear, because it kind of reframed in my head what that role of the senior leader is.
So what is it? But so given that's not it, and so often this structure is actually that, right? It's approvals and such.
Right.
What is the? I mean, maybe you're saving this for the book, but what
No,
what is
I think I know it has something to do with the planning and preparation, right? Enabling operations, right? But you can't reach down and meddle in daily operations, and you can't require them to have to get approvals for every little thing, right? Because the tempo of operation so far outstrips the capacity of the up and down communication structures, and then they get back involved in assessment, improvement, progression, right? How are we doing, right? What adjustments are necessary? Is the mission wrong, right? Do we need to change the mission? So in my mind, I mean, that was I love these kind of things that bifurcate activities, right? Fast and slow. You got leaders are involved in planning and preparation, and then again at assessment and improvement, but not typically in operations, right? Just to be able to maybe oversimplify. But the advice you gave to me, right? I think that's very helpful because it actually says what the roles really are at the most senior levels.
Yeah, and I think this should provide more clarity to, again, the role of leadership, right? If it's leadership can change the structure, and it's actually very hard for individual teams to change the structure. So for me, I know in terms of my growth slow growth over many years as a leader, one of the things that impacted me most, which I think, again, this is a much crisper and more precise language that you have here, Gene, but Ben Horowitz, I read this in one of his blog posts, but it was not immediately forwarded to you, I think, but it was in The Hard Thing About Hard Things, where he talks about communication architecture. It's the responsibility of the CEO, of the leader of the organization, and maybe leader of the part of the organization, to actually set up what we would now call the structure and dynamic to enable an effective communication architecture. And again, I think your language here is much richer to prevent too many things from flowing up, because that's much slower. And there are a lot of, I think, new concepts here as well, right? To actually understand and be able to measure how much slower value gets delivered to the customer, to the mission, if it has to go up versus if it was just horizontal. But fundamentally, I think what I just heard you say is that it is the role of leadership to actually change that structure, to make sure that the right signals are amplified, to make sure that there's room for improvement of daily work across the organization. And the improvement of daily work for leaders is to really improve the structure to support the right dynamics. So, okay, so Gene, tell anything else we've missed with in terms of key things that have delighted you, that surprised you on this journey of helping us as an industry understand what dynamic learning organizations are, and then how to help bring our teams, our organizations towards that.
Yeah, I think there's one thing that has convinced me that understanding this is important. And it's that functional specialization is not going away. When you look at healthcare, the number of specialties have gone from, like, say, 2 in the 1950s to like hundreds now, right? And the same thing is obviously happening in technology, right? You got not just operations, you got virtualization experts, container experts, Kubernetes experts, right? Kafka experts, right? I mean, it's just you can't do a good job, using Kafka if you don't have experts somewhere that actually know how to, what to do and what not to do. And so I think what it says is that the degree of which we actually need to do integrated problem solving is increasing across an ever widening field of functional specialties. And so I think the reason why we've been able to get away with it for the last century is that the functional specialties was small enough where we could just muddle through. Whereas now, I think it's clearly not working. In fact, oh my gosh, Mik, I saw this incredible statistic. I saw Steve showing it to a group at MIT Sloan. He said you got Moore's law, right, where the CPU computation is doubling every 18 months, maybe increasing these days. And it's in the pharmaceutical business, it is actually going the other way. For every given $1 billion, how many therapeutics can you actually get to market? And it's actually going down over the last decades.
Yeah.
And so the hypothesis or the conjecture is that it's the same phenomenon at play, where here's a way to measure the retardation of productivity as you increase the number of specialties, and yet we were able to get we were able to develop a COVID vaccine, within a year of mass awareness of the outbreak. So it just shows that again, during dire emergencies, we can get things done, but when it's not an emergency, things are not treating us so well.
Yeah, that you're just reminding me of when I took a semiconductors course and we were talking about Moore's law. The professor actually said, "Well, Moore's law is on track. Things continue doubling." This was years ago, but the cost of fabs of plants is actually rising even faster than Moore's law. So there's something. The complexity of plants got to that point where it's actually, I think you and I were delighted by the fact that processor performance is now coming from changing the structure of the processor itself by sticking memory right next to the CPU, as Apple did with the M1. Because again, the complexity of fabs is probably now somewhere near the top of complexity that we can handle organizationally, right? Just like the complexity of bringing a new drug to market and testing it is probably at the limits of human, what the complexity an organization can manage. So again, just amazing that you are giving us a language for understanding these things, because I think and this is back to, I think, I can't wait for the next things that you're going to say around the simplification. I think in the end, you're finding tools or this is a way of reasoning about how to reduce complexity and how to reduce organization complexity and how to, basically move away from that complexity causing all of these communication lines that are ineffective to ones that deliver value. So Gene, I guess I'm sure you're going to have a ton of people really curious about learning more on this. I know we've got the kind of, my favorite learning event, or one of my two favorite learning events, the ones in Vegas, ones in London of the year, or virtual now, but still just as amazing, even though we don't get to see each other in person anymore. But the learnings have definitely not slowed down, and the relationships that come from it have just been tremendous. So tell us where we can learn more. Tell us what we can expect to learn at DevOps Enterprise Summit, London Virtual. And anything else that you'd like to wrap up with?
Yeah, I'm so excited that we're putting together what I'm hoping will be the best DevOps enterprise ever, just as we've done year after year. So, we have some amazing stories. Julia Harrison is speaking from the UK Government Digital Service about how she developed capabilities that helped every government agency in a time of dire global pandemic. You'll be speaking about lessons learned in terms of how treatment plans have worked and not worked when they were misdiagnosed, which I'm very, very excited about. We have an executive team from Nationwide Building Society. Corey Quinn, the cloud economist, will be talking about top things that we get wrong in the cloud, which is great.
Awesome.
We have an amazing story from HMRC, Her Majesty's Revenue Collection Service, in terms of what they did, to make the lives of UK citizens easier. Again, in the worst economic downturn in a century. Oh, and again, Dr. Ron Westrom, who many have read, but few have actually seen or heard from, he will be presenting, and I'm so excited that he's going to be sharing in more fidelity than I think any of us have had in terms of his decades of research, both in healthcare and nuclear reactor safety operations and aviation. So yeah, it is a phenomenal set of experience reports, expert talks, and I am super looking forward to it.
Excellent. Me too. And I think, for those who haven't attended, I think one of the lasting effects of it is the fact that it's the whole community comes on Slack, and you're connecting all of these individuals specialized in very different areas. But again, where I think that, the collective relationships that come from this actually provide, to me, and I think to many others, the kind of dynamics that has made this year much easier, right? As we've all remained connected throughout this past year. So Gene, any last words?
The help I'm looking for is, Mik, this is really kind of one of the first times I'm actually speaking publicly about this thing that we've been working on. And so it's hard to say you're working on a book when, you as an author, you also know that this is a very treacherous, curvy path.
Yes, I'm impressed at how bold you've been. So, yeah.
But, I guess I am actually very much looking for feedback in terms of, how does the language resonate with you? To what degree is it helpful? Any suggestions or examples would be fantastic. So if you have any feedback from me, you can reach me on probably Twitter is a great way. I'm at RealGeneKim, or you can email me, genek@itrevolution.com.
Yeah, and I think I do encourage everyone listening to do that, right? Because once these ideas get in your head, they won't come out. I can tell you that from experience. And they will give you better tools for evaluating what works. Again, some of these ideals that you want to see in your organization, what's suppressing them, what's stopping them, and how we get to, again, this faster flow and and these high-performing organizations. So Gene, thank you so much. I hope everyone sends you, the ways that they've started adopting this already, and then feeds that back into your book, because I think it's just been amazing how you incorporate and can always riff with the community through Twitter and elsewhere on how these things apply, and in the end make everyone's days easier and make organizations more successful. So thank you so much.
Delighted to be here, and I can't wait for our next bi-monthly call, twice a month call, of which so many of these ideas came from. So catch you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Gene.
A huge thank you to Gene for joining me on this episode. For more, follow me in my journey on LinkedIn, Twitter, or using the hashtags Mik or Project to Product. Gene's Twitter handle is @RealGeneKim if you want to reach out to him directly. I have a new episode every 2 weeks, so hit subscribe to join us again. You can also search for Project to Product to get the book, and remember that all author proceeds go to supporting women and minorities in technology. Thanks, stay safe, and until next time.